Men that are highly educated with a profound lack of understanding is what has gotten this country to the position we're in today. We're losing Iraq, we're losing Afghanistan. You lost 40 years with the drug war. 112,000 people died last year. 40 years ago, you had 2,500. And the same mistakes get continuously made.
What are we talking about? What are we talking about? What are we talking about?
You wanted to discuss.
Right. I saw the email you sent me.
Did you read it?
No, but I saw it, which is really, honestly.
I prefaced the whole thing for you, laid it out.
And I agree. I agree. I'm wrong about not looking at it. But I was very busy. Very busy. Well, I just bought the fifth season of Entourage. So I'm studying how Hollywood works by watching Entourage. Wait, I remember what it was. It was drugs. It was the expansion of drugs and how the federal government has caused this massive influx of drugs and made it into what it is today, as opposed to what it would have been had they just stayed out of it. Something like that.
Okay.
Isn't that what did you, I'm sure you put it more eloquently.
Yes, that's about right.
Okay. So what is it?
Well, I wanted to start out with the personal anecdote.
Okay. Okay.
In 1997, U.S. Marshals transported me to the Federal Detention Center in Northern California. The government had already obtained multiple indictments charging me in multiple venues with participating in a wide-ranging drug conspiracy to distribute cocaine and crystal amphetamine.
Right.
The FBI and DEA, a few years earlier, had assembled a strike force to target what the government characterized as the Robles drug ring. The drug activity at issue in both of my federal prosecutions originated out of Los Angeles, where I'm from. Notably, some 8 years earlier, the then newly formed Sinaloa cartel had adopted Los Angeles as its American base of operations. A number of the individuals involved on the supply side of the conspiracies charged in both of my federal prosecutions were key operatives in the cartel's American-based distribution network. The reason why I began with the personal anecdote is to illustrate an important point. Not one of the kilograms of cocaine distributed throughout the course of the conspiracy underlying both of my federal prosecutions was laced with fentanyl.
Right.
In fact, throughout the first 25 years of the Sinaloa cartel's existence, not 1 kilogram of cocaine that entered the United States from Mexico was laced with fentanyl. Likewise, the same was true with methamphetamine. Last year, there were 112,000 drug-related fatalities in the United States. 40 years ago, when the Reagan administration declared the modern war on drugs, there were only 2,500. How has the number of fatalities increased 45-fold in the past 4 decades, notwithstanding the federal government having spent hundreds of billions of dollars on law enforcement to reduce the supply of illegal drugs? I know the answer to that question, and it's not what most people think.
Okay. Well, I was just going to say they're just incredibly bad at it. What? Money? What is it?
Well, as we get through our discussion, I'll lay it out for you.
Okay.
Last year, I was released from federal prison after serving 25 years.
Yeah.
You've asked me to appear on your podcast to discuss the international drug trade and the structural changes to the market from when I was active. There have been fundamental changes. The drug markets from 30 years ago were very different than today's. They share almost no similarity. Unlike other commentators, I bring a different perspective to the table. My views are based on not only my own personal knowledge, they're also informed by the interactions I had with many large-scale traffickers while spending over 2 decades in federal prison.
Right. Okay.
That's that one.
Oh, my God. There's lots of papers.
Okay. Do you want to make a comment or something at this point? Or how do we do this? I mean,
we're doing it right now. This is it. This is the podcast. So
you have no input.
Cocaine
use in the United States began to rise in the 1960s, prompting Congress in 1970 to classify it as a controlled substance. By 1980, cocaine had been embraced by the social elite, consumed in fashionable nightclubs in Manhattan and Beverly Hills, and other wealthy enclaves. Cocaine had become a status symbol. A single gram of cocaine in New York City cost $600.
Okay.
Illustrating that point, in 2024 dollars, that would be the equivalent of $2,400 for a gram.
Right. Okay.
In the days of Pablo Escobar, 2 powerful Colombian cartels controlled the cocaine market from cultivation to production in South America, to transportation and distribution in the United States. Over 90% of the product being shipped to the U.S. was landing in Miami. In 1982, the Reagan administration created the South Florida Task Force. This was the centerpiece of our government's cocaine supply reduction strategy, which focused on disrupting the Colombian operations.
One of the most critical duties that we faced upon taking office was controlling the influx of illegal drugs into this country. The South Florida Task Force, which we established under the leadership of Vice President George Bush, has, in the opinion of virtually all knowledgeable observers, been highly successful in slowing the illegal flow of drugs into the United States.
There were some 2,500 drug-related fatalities the year before the Reagan administration declared the modern war on drugs in January 1982. As I indicated earlier, last year, there was 112,000. Likewise, according to the DEA, back in 1982, there were some 40 to 48 tons of cocaine coming into the United States every year. Now, that may sound like a lot.
Right.
However,
Does sound
just
like a lot.
a decade later, once the Mexicans took over the distribution, you had 80 tons coming into the country a month.
Okay. So 10,
So you had
20 times as
yes,
much.
there was a 20-fold
More than 20.
increase in just over a decade.
More than 20. Almost
The numbers
30.
don't lie.
Right.
Okay. By every conceivable metric, the policies our government have put into place have been spectacularly a failure. Targeting the Colombian operations back in the 1980s was the first mistake our government made. The DEA, assuming they were genuinely interested in targeting the drug issue, then the FBI and DEA should have ignored the Colombians entirely and focused their efforts on targeting the first-line American distributor. And here's why. The Colombians controlled both the production and the distribution aspect of the market. Well, when any organization or business controls both the production and distribution, what's that called?
A cartel?
It's called a monopoly.
Monopoly? Okay.
Now, what's the defining characteristic of a monopoly?
I mean, you have complete control of the market.
Monopolies engage in anti-competitive business practices in order to keep the prices high.
Okay.
Now, think about it. If you're a government waging a war on drugs, don't you want high prices?
Yeah.
Why don't you just let the market do what the market's going to normally do? Remember, when it started, it was $600 a gram.
Right. It's because when it started, it was like for rich people.
That's exactly what it is. Look, by 1982, the Colombian distributors in the U.S. were paying their suppliers in Colombia $25,000 per kilo.
Right.
That's over $100,000 today per unit. Okay. That's a high price for a product that is basically agricultural
Right.
and essentially has very inexpensive chemical processing. The drug organizations in Colombia were generating over $100 million per month in 1982 dollars, making a whopping 700 to 800% profit per unit. Now, why was targeting the Colombian operation a mistake? Because the Colombians, like all monopolists, had an incentive to refrain from flooding the market. Had they flooded the market, prices would have dropped. It would have squeezed their fat profit margins.
Right. So why did but they did flood the market.
No, they didn't. Not when they were controlling both the
I
production
understand,
and
but
distribution.
when the government got involved, they flooded the market because now the prices are super low in comparison.
And that's what I was saying. The initial mistake was in targeting the Colombians at all. You should have limited the operation to the American first-line distributors.
Right.
See, look, we live in a capitalist society. Nearly all of our political leaders, espouse their love of the free market, their admiration for the free market system, and their undying devotion to the free market. And yet, all of these proponents of the free market system don't actually understand how markets work.
Right.
Market participants respond to incentives. By successfully targeting the Colombian operations in the U.S., our government eliminated the players who had a financial incentive not to flood the market. There were 48 tons of cocaine smuggled into the U.S. the entire year before the government declared its war on drugs. That comes out to 4 tons a month. You went from 4 tons a month to 80 tons a month in just over a decade.
Right.
That's a 20-fold.
So they're having to put 20 times out more product out to get the same amount of money in. Right? So they're flooding it because they're still trying to maintain the amount of money that they're making.
Flooding it in response to our government's actions.
Right.
Because if you'll notice, and as we work our way through the conversation, one, they targeted the Colombian importation. And that's where the South Florida Task Force was targeting, in particular, the small aircraft flying into the Miami area. So in Colombia, look, if you're sending 4,000 units to the United States every month, That's 4 metric tons. You're going to produce somewhere in the neighborhood of 4,500. Let's say the government ends up knocking off 10% of the
Yeah,
flights.
yeah, they're going to get some, yeah.
All right. Well, they're running a lean operation. Once the government started investing billions of dollars into its interdiction policy, what happens? The number of losses that Colombians begin to sustain are enormous.
Right.
30% of the losses, 40%, 50%.
So they just pump out more product.
That's right.
Right.
So, in other words, the more product that gets intercepted, the more product they have to make. So the first unintended consequence was they turned around and drove the Colombians into increasing their production capacity.
Right.
Before they were generating 4,500 keys to get 4,000 into the United States. Now they're generating 9,000 to get 4,000 into the States. 12,000. Now you can say, well, that's not so big of a bad deal because they're still intercepting half of the loads. Well, that's assuming they're not going to react. See, the guys from Harvard, the guys from Yale, apparently they thought that the Colombians are just going to lay there and take it in the ass.
Right.
Well, they had a plan. And so the purpose of our conversation is to illustrate how the government's actions have prompted the counterparties to change their incentives. So by successfully interdicting so many flights, they, one, prompted the Colombians to scale their production.
Right.
Two, they prompted the Colombians to seek for an alternative route.
Okay, which was through Mexico.
Yes. And once the Colombians started sustaining 50% losses, they started looking for the alternative route. Now, notably, by this point, 2 years into the South Florida Task Force, now you're talking early 84. You got the Reagan administration officials boasting to the media that they had broken the back of the Colombians.
Right.
Whenever you hear a guy from Harvard or Yale or Georgetown going on about how they broke the back of their adversaries, you know you're about to get the horns.
Right. Okay.
Because that's when the Colombians said, okay, we're tired of sustaining 50% losses. They went looking for another alternative. Mexico has served as a platform for smuggling for well over a century.
Right.
Beginning in the 1930s, the majority of the marijuana consumed in the United States was imported through Mexico.
Right.
Before that, they smuggled alcohol into the States during Prohibition. Being a smuggler, a contrabandista, is a long tradition for powerful families that live along the border. And they pass along their networks from generation to generation. And so when the Colombians reached out to the Mexicans in the early 1980s, there was already a marijuana trafficking syndicate in Mexico, a powerful group called the Guadalajara Cartel. They were led by a guy named Miguel Feliz Gallardo. And so when Escobar and the head of the Cali cartel, Rodriguez, contacts Gallardo, they say, hey, we understand you're
Can you throw some of our
producing
some of
marijuana and smuggling it into
Can
the
you
gringos.
throw a couple of keys of coke along with those 40 keys of marijuana that you're
Whoa,
shipping?
they're not 40.
Well, you know what I'm saying.
Tons.
I understand. But can you throw some of our coke in that shipment?
And of course, and when they
It'll
told
be
them,
profitable.
well, not just that though, much more lucrative, because the Colombians offered to pay $1,000 per kilo.
Right.
The Mexicans are making $50 a pound
Right.
with the marijuana. So all of a sudden, they're making 20 times per unit
For a lot less
for a
volume.
lot less volume.
Yeah.
And so, of course, Feliz Gallardo says, of course, send it. So now when the Colombians begin supplying the Mexicans with cocaine, it's not at the 4,500 kilo per month number. It's at the new higher 12,000 kilo per month number.
Right.
So 2 years into the war, our leaders are claiming victory. A year after that, it's 3 times as much product coming into the country. You'd have been better off not doing nothing.
Right.
Abolishing the DEA, taking the tens of billions of dollars and burning it, and it would have been a more effective counter-narcotic strategy. All you've managed to do now is triple the production, and the Colombians are making more money than ever. Why? Because the number of loads getting intercepted plummeted. Before, 90% of the product was coming into Miami, the bottleneck.
Right.
Now you've got a 2,500-mile border. You got 36 ports of entry. Everything's just coming through.
Yeah.
They're shooting into LA, they're shooting into Albuquerque, into Phoenix, into Houston, San Antonio. All of a sudden, now the Americans like, what happened?
Tens of thousands of cars, which you can't search all of them, and plus tunnels.
Yes, and so at that point, you would think that a reasonable individual would say, you know what? Perhaps we need to stop and reassess our strategy, because at the end of the third year mark, we've got 3 times as much product coming into the country. That's not the way the government works.
That's not how it works.
That's not the way the guys from Harvard or Yale or Princeton work.
Right. I was just thinking, we did a podcast earlier today, and the guy had mentioned the Pentagon Papers. That was it during Vietnam, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they're talking, and for like 5-6 years, they had, prior to them being released, the Pentagon had known we cannot win this war.
Yeah.
And instead of saying, hey, let's reevaluate our strategy, they said, no, let's just keep throwing. We got the industrial complex going. We're killing. Of course, you're killing, tens of thousands of Americans, but those are poor brown people, so we don't care about them. So they just keep going and going, and let's just try and get it to a point where we can say we've won, or we can at least negotiate, or like it went on for years and years. You've known you can't win this war.
And
so why keep going?
And that's essentially the problem that we've had. Look, it comes down to essentially no accountability. All of these guys, they want to exercise authority, but they don't want to be responsible.
Right.
And, a normal business operation, when your objectives fail spectacularly, you can either change the goal or change the strategy. The government does neither. They just double down.
Yeah, I was going to say. Can't you just take responsibility
because the guy from Harvard can't do that.
Take responsibility. You get two level.
Sentence reduction.
Yes,
you can't. They don't.
And if you do it immediately, it's another level.
It's a lack of humility, where these guys generally think that they're the best and the brightest.
Right. Well, I mean,
and they can't fathom that they're getting outsmarted by a guy with a grade school education.
Yeah. Could Chapo even read? Like, didn't he? Chapo Guzman, could he even read? Like,
well, let me tell you about Joaquin Guzman.
Okay.
Guzman grew up in a peasant family. He had a 3rd grade education. One of the most shameful demonstrations of arrogance I've ever seen is when our government bureaucrats were celebrating his apprehension and being brought to the United States. Like, every one of these goofballs come up there, they're patting each other on the back, acting like they took a big bite out of crime. But they didn't stop and think for a moment. You guys have been chasing this man for 29 years. You have spent billions of dollars chasing this man.
Mm-hmm.
And for 29 years, he pumped hundreds of billions of dollars worth of drugs into your country, amassed a fortune in the billions.
Order the murders of
God knows how many thousands of people in Mexico.
Right.
And so for you to sit up there and behave in such a undignified manner,
right?
You could go out, announce the arrest, and keep moving. That's not how they portrayed it. I've kept waiting for one of these guys to come to the podium with his head hung down in shame and tender his resignation after apologizing to the American people that it took 29 years to catch a man with a 3rd grade fucking education.
Right.
You had a man that's functionally illiterate mocking you. And you know where they caught him? In Monchi, Sinaloa. It's a 500-mile drive from San Diego.
Right.
It took you 29 years to catch a guy with a 3rd grade education 500 miles from our border?
Well, what about Mayo? Never been able to catch Mayo.
Never been, he's...
How's that even possible?
Just very circumspect.
Right.
And the point is, it was the level of celebration that I found to be a little disgusting, particularly because if you look at it, how do the leaders from other countries view this? Did you think it's a celebration, worthy of a celebration? You think the Chinese were taking them 29 years to catch this guy? How about the Russians? They'd have bombed a whole other country.
I was going to say, they'd have just
The Israelis would have sent their squads in to go get this guy. Yeah, it took 29 years for the DOJ to track this guy down. And then for them to celebrate in that manner was indicative of the way...
The arrogance.
The arrogance.
Well, also, what happens when who fills that void when he disappears? You know what I'm saying? Well,
again, look.
Or are you saying he wasn't really running anything at that time?
He was running his organization.
Right.
The American media likes to use this term cartel, but in reality, it's a misnomer. First of all, a cartel is a group of men, group of organizations that collude to control price. They don't control price. They're actually competing against each other. Essentially, it's just a federation of organizations. It's a network of associations that band together for specific activities.
Yeah, I was gonna say they're actually infighting, but they'll be actually at war and infighting, and still agree on how they're going to get this load into the United States. They'll still kind of work together in certain aspects.
The importation from Colombia into Mexico,
right?
The transportation to the United States. Once it gets to Los Angeles, it's a free for all.
Well, I understand, but it's like the Sinaloa is using the new generation to do this, even though maybe they're at war.
No, it doesn't work.
Okay.
It's all in-house. Both camps essentially operate independent of one another. The only time that they have interactions, sharing common associates, are with the Chinese.
Oh, okay. I thought like the Sinaloa might have product that they need to move through these tunnels, and they'll come up with an agreement.
They'll use their own tunnels.
They'll use their own tunnels. Okay.
Yeah.
I didn't realize that. I thought there were certain times when they would work together.
They certainly did, and there was a period about a decade ago where there was understandings between the two of them.
Right, but not now.
Not now.
Okay.
And part of as you get later on in our discussion, you'll see that the arrest of Guzman was essentially the death knell of what was genuinely the Sinaloa cartel.
Didn't the new generation, weren't they the ones who dug the tunnel to get Guzman out of prison the one time he...
Yes, but that's because there's family associations.
Okay, well, it's way more complicated.
Guzman's wife is related to new generation leadership.
Okay.
And so it's a family tie. It wasn't cross-cartel activity. Okay. And so, part of the misunderstanding is this notion that it's all one big, huge syndicate, when in reality, it's just a group of independent organizations.
Right.
Sometimes this group is working with that group. Oftentimes, they're competing against each other.
Okay.
And so when you asked the question, well, what happened after Guzman left? Well, when Guzman went away, his sons took over. And that was essentially the end. Because, first of all, they're young. So the guys that are, the 30 or 40 other organizations that were part of this loose confederation, they're not going to listen to some 29-year-old.
Right.
These are guys in their 50s. Like, you haven't earned that position.
Right.
Your father may have earned it, but you haven't earned it. And where you had the final rupture was over fentanyl. Because Zambada and his people are old school. They came up when the last time the conduct of Mexican traffickers provoked a response from the American government. And so there were rules that were put in place after the killing of a DEA agent back in the mid-'80s, Agent Camarena, where don't harm American law enforcement. Don't harm American civilians. Do not cut the product with anything that's going to harm the American customer.
Right.
And those concerns were addressed because what they didn't want to do was kick the sleeping bear. Because when the previous leadership from the original cartel, the Guadalajara cartel, killed Camarena, the response was just enormous. I mean, the American government was sending bounty hunters into Mexico to snatch guys up. Reagan actually shut down the entire border. There's like no commerce. And so the amount of pressure they brought to bear was so enormous that the Mexican government went and they arrested Caro Quintero. They went and they arrested Fonseca. They went and arrested dozens of men to appease the pressure from the Americans. And so those mid-level operatives, the Chapo Guzmans, the Mayo Zambadas, these were all guys in their 30s at the time. Well, they learned a very valuable lesson. do not awaken the slumbering giant.
Right.
Well, the newer generation, the younger guys today, the Menchos,
Right.
Los Chapitos, Guzman's kids, they weren't around back then. That's why when I said earlier that the structure of the trade is fundamentally different, because 30 years ago, it was don't harm the American customer. You don't need to maximize profits per unit. Make up the difference through volume. Just sell a lot more units.
Right.
Today, the groups are so much smaller. They don't have the capital. Back in 20 years ago, they were buying 20 tons at a time from Colombians. Well, today you've got a bunch of independent operators. Well, first of all, they're not accumulating the product at the same price point because they're not buying in such volume. They're going to have to pay higher transit fees, and they're getting smaller quantities. So today, if someone's got 300 kilos of cocaine, what are they going to do? They're going to get 400 or 500 kilos of lidocaine, cut it, and then lace it with 30 kilos, and send that to the United States. Well, it's become a gold rush mentality. It's all short-term interests, whereas the people that built the modern cartel structure, they invested their lives into it.
Right.
They were building something to last generations. Well, the guys operating today aren't thinking generations.
Right.
They're just thinking, how do I cash in right now? Which is why you had the big rupture within Sinaloa, where Zambada and his people broke away from Guzman's people. And so today when you hear, the government saying, well, the Sinaloa cartel, there's no Sinaloa cartel. There are a number of organizations who happen to be from Sinaloa.
Right.
Many of whom are at each other's throats. And so what the American people normally expect to be the old Sinaloa cartel are the ones that have stayed away from the cartel. But you're talking about Zambada. Zambada's pushing 80 years old.
Right.
His right-hand man's pushing 70. I mean, these guys, their time has passed. And a guy like Mencho, who's in his 50s, well, he's not taking orders from some 80-year-old man. Now, they may respect the guy, but Miles stays out of the way at this point. He just wants to be able to enjoy his sunset years.
Right. Didn't he try and pay his way out of...
Yeah, he offered a settlement.
He offered a settlement. He offered a settlement to the Mexican government to pay him like an outrageous amount of money to say, like, just pardon me and let me live out the rest of my life. And they were like, no. Like, he was like going to give him, I forget what it was, how many, whatever, $500 million or something. It was some outrageous amount of money. And they were like, no. Of course, that's the same thing that God, come on, what's his name? He was in Colombia. They Pablo. Didn't he try to say, I'll pay off the national debt?
Yeah.
If you'll just quash this whole thing and pardon me. They were like, no. But I mean, that's what, like, instead of him having to go to prison, let me just pay off the national debt. It's like, how much money have you got?
Yeah.
So.
And so yeah, they're still operating, but it's on a much more modest scale because they're still focusing on primarily the old cocaine markets.
Right.
Well, the profits may be 200 or 300%, whereas for the new generation, they're focusing primarily on related, primarily on amphetamine. Well, these are 1,000% profits per unit.
Well, plus, haven't they diversified too? Now they're like, they've got these meth labs that are massive, these super labs too. They can make their own product, so they don't even, it's not like their whole strategy is just where it was at one point, where it was marijuana and then marijuana and coke. Now it's like marijuana, coke.
Yeah, they're all polydrug at this point.
Only I was going to say although marijuana is now they're just getting it from the Americans or growing it in.
And so to finish off the earlier point, it was by attacking the Colombian monopolies back in the 80s, you actually incentivized the flooding of the cocaine because when the Colombians lost control of the distribution market, the Mexicans were able to step in.
Right.
Well, their incentives are very different because the Mexicans don't have a monopoly. They're middlemen. How does the middleman make his money? On volume.
But yeah.
So whereas when the Colombians controlled both, they were restricting the amount of product to keep prices artificially high. Once they lost control of the distribution, the Mexicans are like, we'll handle distribution. Just send us the product. But now the Colombians aren't. So now the Mexicans are saying send us as much as you can.
Right.
Meanwhile, the Colombians are delivering it to them in Mexico. Well, they're not getting LA prices. They're getting Acapulco prices. So they're paying $5,000 per unit rather than getting $25,000 per unit. So they're taking a 75% hit on revenue. But there isn't a corresponding drop of 75% of their expenses.
Right.
So in order to make up that revenue shortfall, what do they got to do? Triple up production.
Right.
So they go from 4 tons to 12 tons a month in 3 years. 2 years later, they're at 20 tons. 10 years later, they're at 80 tons. Again, had you done nothing, it'd have been a more effective counter-narcotic strategy. Now, I can already hear your people in your audience or in the comment section saying, oh, come on, Rausini, hindsight's 2020.
Right.
Obviously, the government didn't know that this was going to happen.
Well, at some point, it's been too long of a span for somebody at some point to not have written a Pentagon paper saying, look, this isn't working. We need to change strategy. But then how do you sell that to the American public? In my opinion, the American public is, they're used to getting their news in sound bites. How can I explain my strategy in less than 30 seconds? So it's arrest more, fight harder, arrest more of them.
And that's,
grab more of the product, whatever.
And that's all manifestations.
Lock them up longer.
That's all manifestations of the same problem.
Well, I understand, but you can sell that.
Yes, but you have to be a little bit more sophisticated. And so when you're saying, well, let's lock them up longer.
It's hard to sell sophistication to a public that is educated in the public school system of the United States that is basically designed to create factory workers. Like you're educating people just enough
to be drones.
Yep. To get a job, a W-2 job, and do what Bill tells you to do, be trained within 2 weeks, and work for 40 years and retire and get Social Security. Like that's what the system is. So to explain something sophisticated to that person who really just wants to work 40 hours a week, go on vacation 1 or 2 weeks a year, and watch 4 or 5 different sitcoms and watch his kid play, whatever, Little League. Like that guy doesn't like it to explain a sophisticated approach to a problem is difficult.
That's where the quality of the leadership comes into play. The last time we had someone as a leader that was accountable was Kennedy.
You saw what happened to him.
Well, but the point being here is when Kennedy won his presidency,
right,
he inherited a plan from the previous administration to try to topple the Cuban regime.
Right.
That failed spectacularly in the Bay of Pigs. What was Kennedy's reaction? He goes on television, says, hey, buck stops with me. I was wrong. It didn't work. Fires the CIA director, fired everybody at the CIA and the National Security Council associated with this plan. Well, the parallel in 1985, 3 years into the drug war, and you've now got a tripling of the amount of product coming into the country. Reagan should have said, okay, new drugs you're fired. You had a tripling on your watch. DEA director, fired. FBI director, fired. Nobody was held accountable.
Right.
And once you had a tripling of the amount of product coming into the country, it created a lot of problems. Because the retail price plummeted by 50%. It went from being $600 a gram to $300 a gram. Well, by lowering the price, what's that do? Brought in some prospective user base.
Yeah. There's more demand. Yeah.
No, not only more demand, because look, wealth distribution in the United States takes into the form of a pyramid. So you got a broad swath across the bottom with the poor.
Right.
A huge swath with the poor and the lower middle class. Then you got about a 20%, 25% with the middle class. And then you got 35% at the top, which represents your upper middle class and your rich. Well, in 1982, it was only the very tippy top.
Right. Well, so you have a larger group of people that can afford it. When I say there's no more demand, but now everybody can afford it. There was always a demand.
Yeah. So what happens is when the supply increases and the demand remains level, prices drop. So now it's at $300 a gram. Well, the Colombians had to come up with a solution because if they keep sending 12 tons a month, it's going to create a pricing structure. Now, at the time, there's a guy in Los Angeles who was the head of the Cali cartel distribution cell named Mario Villabona. And Mario's a very interesting character in that, his uncle was one of the main guys for Cali. And he had a network of customers, first-line American customers, several of whom were very prominent African-American drug traffickers in Los Angeles. Most notably, one was Michael Harris. Michael Harris later on achieved a measure of fame. You know, he operated under the moniker Harry O. Well, he was the trafficker that put up the money that was later on used for death row records. Now, I know Villabona and Harris in prison. I got to become well acquainted with Mario, good friends with Mike. And so I understand how these events occurred because they're concerned because prices are cratering. Nobody wants to make less per unit. So what they have to do, they had to expand the user base. Well, who's left? The poor, the lower middle class.
Mm-hmm.
The problem with the poor and the lower middle class is they don't got no money.
Right. But there's still demand, so what do? You crack?
Oh, so then that's when Mario spoke to some of the black guys and said, you know what, we've got guys in South Central Los Angeles that have figured out a way how to market it to the poor. What they're doing is diluting the quality of the grain, making it cheap. And they're standardizing the doses, $10 a dose, $20 a dose. So while a poor person may not be able to come in and say, give me $1,000 worth of material, they may buy $20 or $40 worth of material. On the other hand, there's so many more poor people and lower middle class people that in the aggregate, it's actually a bigger market.
Right.
And so Mario says, hey, it's not a bad idea. Let's run with it. Now, of course, the high-end people were concerned that they don't want to tarnish their brand. And had the association of being associated with wealth.
Right.
You know how the upper class in this country don't want nothing to do with the poor people.
Right.
They're not going to be doing the same drug that the poor guys are doing.
Right.
So they decided, you know what, let's market it under a different title. Let's brand it differently. So that's when they called it crack. So as a result of the government's policies targeting the Colombian distributors, you not only resulted in a tripling increase of the amount of product coming into the country, you had a cratering of the price, expanding the user base, and then they came up with an entirely new parallel market that was even larger than the previous one, unleashing an epidemic. None of this would have happened had the government just done nothing.
Right.
It's a classic example of the law of unintended consequences.
Right.
It's pure hubris. So now, remember at the 2-year mark, we'd broken the back of the Colombian cartels. A year later, they're in full panic mode.
Right.
More product, more customers, epidemic raging out of control in the country. So what do? They go to their buddies in Congress and said, you know what, we mean business.
Is that the war on drugs?
Let's toughen the penalties.
Oh.
We'll show these guys.
Okay.
Again, if you've caught the drift of our conversation, the law of unintended consequences says that whenever you undertake an action, you have to expect something happening that is contrary to what you originally anticipated. And the third category of unintended consequences is called the perverse result. The perverse result is when the actions you undertake not only completely backfire, but they make the original problem worse. And so when you increase the penalties, what happens?
I mean, what do you mean? You just lock up more people? I mean,
No,
the price goes up.
You
Okay.
make drug trafficking more lucrative.
Okay.
Every time you increase
You
the
do lock
penalties,
up more people.
you know who benefits? Mexicans.
Right.
They want first-time offenders to get life. Why? Because they can charge you a premium to compensate for the risk. Every time they increase the penalties, they get a raise. Take away parole, they get a raise. Raise up the guidelines, they get a raise. Well, this is elementary economics. Price is a function of not only supply and demand, it's also a function of risk. Increase the risk, increase the profits. So if the plan by raising the penalties was to decrease the drug flow, you've actually increased it. Again, unintended consequence completely backfires on them. What you did is now you made every 14, 15, 16-year-old kid think, you know what, I can make a lot of money selling crack. It ravaged South Central Los Angeles.
Right.
Because of this type of activity. This is a classic example of hubris. The law of unintended consequence states that any intervention in a complex system is bound to have multiple effects, which almost always leads to results that weren't part of the plan. This law of unintended consequences serves as a warning against overconfidence and the illusion of control. For the past 4 decades, we have ignored this lesson. Our leaders, for the most part, have been highly educated men with a profound lack of understanding. In other words, they're schemers.
Schemers trying to control their little world. I try to show the schemers how pathetic their attempts to control things really are.
And so as a result of these guys with their consistent scheming, you've had a series of debacles which have proven to be ultimately catastrophic. And this happens not only in the drug contest, but it's also rampant throughout the rest of our country. And so, for instance, in 2003, George Bush and his administration decided, you know what? We're going to go to war against Iraq.
Right.
Now, of course, Iraq had nothing to do with 9/11, and they didn't have WMDs. But you know what? We're Americans. We want to bomb some shit.
Right.
So we're going.
Right.
The Russians said, hey, it's a mistake. The Germans, the French, the Israelis, Arab nations said it's a mistake. The boys from Harvard and Yale, they don't listen to them. They're the best and the brightest.
Right.
So in March 2003, American forces invade. The Iraqis, what do? Take off their uniforms, vacate the field of battle. Well, to the guy from Yale, we won.
Right.
10 weeks after the invasion, Bush is standing on the flight deck of an aircraft carrier. What was it? The Abraham Lincoln.
Yeah.
He gives a speech to the American people telling them that we prevailed. Behind him on the bridge, on the island, on the carrier's island,
Right.
is a big sign, mission accomplished. He tells the American people the United States has prevailed and today marks the end of major combat operations.
Major combat operations in Iraq have ended. In the Battle of Iraq, the United States and our allies have prevailed.
Do you realize that from that day forward, we suffered 99% of our fatalities? 99%.
Over the next what? How many years?
Over the next decade.
Oh, decade. Okay.
Okay. 99% of the men and women that suffered catastrophic injuries happened after our leaders told us we won.
Right.
We spent $1 trillion in this third world rat hole cesspool of a country after we were told we won. And what's even more illustrating how incompetent the leadership is, ultimately, who won the war?
I mean, we're not there anymore.
The United States goes to war against Iraq.
Right.
Who won?
Well, Iraq, right?
Iran.
Oh, okay.
Today, Iran controls Iraq.
Okay.
So we spend $1 trillion to give Iraq to our enemies. That is the law of unintended consequences. And it is that exact same level of incompetence that has gotten us to the point where we are now today with. It happened back in the 80s. You take out the Colombians, you gave the market to the Mexicans. They just gave it to them. Just like we just gave Iraq to Iran. No accountability. The situations mirror each other exactly. Same thing in Afghanistan. On the day that they announced end of major combat operations in Iraq, they announced end of major combat operations in Afghanistan. Nobody bothered to ask the Iraqis or the Taliban if they surrendered.
Right.
See, the best and the brightest that go to Yale, they assume, whoa, they lay down their arms. We won. No. Anybody with a lick of street smarts would have known. When it gets, what they mistook as a win was the quiet before the storm. Men that are highly educated with a profound lack of understanding is what has gotten this country to the position we're in today. We lose in Iraq. We lose in Afghanistan. You lost 40 years with the drug war. 112,000 people died last year. 40 years ago, you had 2,500. You'd have been better off just doing nothing.
All right.
And the same mistakes get continuously made. And so it's that same kind of incompetence that caused us to lose all these wars, whether it's Iraq, Afghanistan, or in the drug war, is what led to the American bureaucrat running to the American politician and saying, hey, let's jack up the prices or let's jack up the penalty. That'll dissuade them.
Yeah, no.
Well, these people have not only a profound lack of understanding of how markets work, they don't understand human nature. The country on this planet with the toughest drug laws is China. They execute thousands of drug dealers every year.
They still have drug dealers.
Got tons of drug dealers. Some of the largest operations on this planet are being run out of Hong Kong and Guangzhou. Another country that slaughters thousands of drug dealers, Iran. They kill so many drug dealers, it doesn't even make the news.
Okay.
Massive drug problem in Iran. Singapore, first world nation. They execute drug dealers.
Mm-hmm.
You don't think there's cocaine in every one of those upscale nightclubs or in those casinos?
Right.
See, human nature being what it is, men, particularly men with balls, are going to take that chance to pursue wealth, banking on them not being the one caught.
Right.
So unfortunately, Jimmy got knocked off.
But Jimmy's an idiot. I'm smarter than him.
That's exactly the mentality.
That's not going to happen to me.
And if you look at the advancements that have been made just in the last 6 years, the majority of them are men pursuing wealth. We characterize the age of explorers. Well, that's actually a misnomer. When Columbus and those guys got on those rickety-ass boats, they weren't exploring, looking for a new world. They were trying to find a route to the Indies so they could do what? Trade.
Yeah. Make money.
No, because they're going to strike it rich.
Right.
If they can find a route there.
Right.
They got, their plan blew up when they crashed into that continent in the middle.
Right.
But nevertheless, it didn't stop those guys from getting on those boats. They didn't know what awaited for them. Hell, the majority of people on the planet still thought the earth was flat. For all they knew, they're just going to swim, go out to sea and sail right off the edge.
Or how many people left and never came back.
That,
it was extremely dangerous.
Horrible deaths out at sea. And so none of those men knew what waited for them beyond the horizon, and yet every single one of them took that risk. There are millions of men like that in Mexico.
Right.
Or in Colombia. And so this notion that you're going to be able to dissuade people by increasing the penalties was almost childish. The more you increase the penalties, the more drugs come into the country, the more lucrative it becomes, the more drug dealers you create. Now, the most significant mistake that we made when targeting the Colombians was it created a lot of leverage for the Mexicans. For the first couple of years, the Colombians were paying the Mexicans to transport their product. And so the Colombians would bring the product to Mexico. Billy Scarra would say, hey, Chapo, take it to Los Angeles. At that point, Guzman's just a courier. It's a mule.
Right.
Well, he's delivering it to the product to the Colombians in Los Angeles. Well, after a couple of years, Mexicans were like, you know what, you guys are making a lot of money off our back. We're tired of getting paid $1,000 per kilo. What we want is to get paid in kind. We'll take 20% of the load, 30% of the load. And so now, Colombians had no leverage.
Yeah, if they back out, they've got nobody.
They got nobody. So they agree to begin paying in product rather than paying in cash. Well, now for the first time, what you have are the creation of Mexican distribution networks beginning to operate in the United States. At this point, they're still more modest than the Colombians, but they start building out their own parallel running network. And so shortly thereafter, when the boys from Harvard decide, you know what? We really made a mess of things interdicting the product coming from Colombia. Let's target the Colombian distributors. Well, what'd they end up doing? They take out the Colombian distributors. What'd they do? They gave the market to the Mexicans, just like they gave Iraq to Iran.
Right.
And all of a sudden, now the Mexicans are, hey, we already got our parallel distribution network. Just sell it to us. Well, now you had Mexican operations on American soil controlled by Mexican kingpins. Now, why is that important? Because there's a lot more Mexicans than Colombians in the United States. Mario Villabona's trafficking cell in Los Angeles, the largest on the West Coast, is about 6 or 7 men.
Okay.
That's his entire operation. When Sinaloa took over Los Angeles, you had 4 different factions, each with 5 to 10 distribution cells. You went from a half a dozen operatives to hundreds. So you just had this massive scale up. Again, as a direct result of these short-sighted policies by these insecure men who think, well, we're going to show them, we'll be tough.
Right.
Well, sometimes you got to leave well enough alone. Now, that doesn't mean you don't target the traffickers. You just leave the Colombians alone. They could have just kept watching Mario and knocked off every one of his people. But by taking him out of the equation, now Guzman says, hey, you know what? I'll handle it. He's already got his people in LA anyway. That's how they ended up with Los Angeles.
Right.
It just fell into their lap. Once the Mexicans took over, now both parties had incentives to flood the market. That's how we ended up where we are today.
So, my question from 30 minutes ago is, how do you fix it?
Well,
how do you fix the problem? Oh, there's no fixing it. There's no face over. This is just the way it is from here on out.
Well, there are common sense solutions.
Scale back, slowly scale back.
No, what you do is you lower the penalties.
Okay.
Because if you lower the penalties, you disrupt the pricing structure. No man is going to risk 3 or 4 years in prison to make $3,000 a month.
Right.
You can go to Amazon and make that.
Right.
But you'll risk 10 years for $1 million.
Right.
I'm not saying legalize. I'm not saying decriminalize. I'm saying lower the penalties. Because if the penalties plummet, the profit margins plummet. Price is a function of risk. If there's a very light negative consequence, there's a very small amount of profits to be made. Well, you're going to cause two things. One, the number of drug traffickers getting involved shrinks. More importantly, the source countries, the Colombians, they're going to say, no. Shrink the amount of product coming into the country to artificially raise the prices.
Right.
So by reinstituting parole and lowering the penalties, you're going to get less product in a year and less traffickers. Of course, our insecure leaders would never undertake that kind of action because it opens them up for being soft on crime or being weak. The problem with these insecure men is that they're not willing to take the position that, look, this is the smarter route for us to go.
Right.
And obviously, 40 years of evidence has demonstrated it doesn't work. Unfortunately, I don't think they're ever going to undertake that kind of action. Now, there are other solutions, but that requires a level of sophistication that we haven't seen. And so, for instance, when in 2001, when armed forces invaded Afghanistan, and 9/11 happened in September, we started bombing in October, ground forces went in November. By December, the Taliban regime toppled. Well, we went in with what was considered a light footprint. There weren't enough men to occupy the entire country. So they had to enter into relationships with what the American media characterized as local warlords.
Right.
Well, those local warlords were actually traffickers.
Right.
So one of the largest was a guy named Haji Norzai. Well, Norzai had a 20,000 man militia. The American government is paying Norzai millions of dollars, keep his men off the field. At a minimum, don't support the Taliban. Preferably join the new Afghani government. He gets a position in the government. He's the largest opium producer in the world. The largest trafficker in the world.
It probably opened up some opportunities for him.
It opened up a tremendous amount of opportunities for him. And so Norzai is able to become our man in Havana, essentially. And that's the kind of sophistication the American government would have to demonstrate. Say, look, obviously, you're not going to cut this deal with Mencho. Obviously, you're miles out of the way. He's 80 years old. You need to find somebody who's like in his 40s, maybe 50, someone a little bit more sophisticated, and come to him and say, look, what we're going to do is we're going to focus on removing these other operations. You are going to be the beneficiary. You're going to remain in position so long as there's no.
Right.
Now, we're going to try to intercept all your other loads. That's the game. But we're not coming after you. We're going after them. And we expect you, on the other hand, to enforce it. Now, if you want to stop fentanyl coming into the United States now? Go get Chapo Guzman out of prison. Put him back in Mexico. Tell me you got 6 fucking months. Stop the fentanyl.
How many people would he kill?
He might have to let him know there's a new sheriff in town.
Yeah, yeah.
But after the first 1,000 or so people get decapitated, people will be like, oh, stop producing it.
Right.
Because 25 years ago when he was running things, nobody cut his product. And so that's the kind of creative solutions. Now, obviously, no one's going to go grab Guzman and put him back into Mexico.
Right.
But there are plenty of people that are in their 40s right now who you can make this kind of an arrangement with.
Right.
And this is essentially what we did in Afghanistan. And what's interesting is, we used Norzai for a few years, then we double cross him.
Right.
Another guy was Haji Khan, massive cocaine trafficker. Same thing, use him for a number of years, then we double cross him. They actually bring Norzai to the United States, prosecute him in New York, give him a life sentence. You know where he's at today?
No.
Back in Afghanistan. They commuted his sentence, give him clemency.
When did that happen?
That happened 3 years ago. They cut a deal. So as part of the withdrawal plan, they're saying, send us back our men. So that was part of the package.
Right.
And so this notion that, the government won't get into bed with large-scale drug traffickers, that's absurd.
Yeah.
That's how we controlled Afghanistan. They literally contracted the largest traffickers to be the police force. And when necessary to end the deal, to complete the war, those that we apprehended, we actually gave them commutations and sent them home. I actually have the commutation order if you want to see it.
No, I'm good. So there's no real clear solution other than putting people in power that can get rid of the fentanyl and take out some of their rivals. And
that's the only solution to the fentanyl issue. The only solution to the fentanyl issue is a coordinated effort where you're saying, look, we're going to enter into an arrangement with a somewhat reasonable party who understands that he's the beneficiary so long as there's no coming out of his production. Like the old Zambada organization.
Right.
They're not doing.
Right.
Go find one of their guys that are in their 40s. It can't be Guzman's former organization because it's being ran by his sons, and they've gone all in on.
Okay.
And that's where you had the fallout, the big schism within Sinaloa proper, was over the issue. Obviously, it can't be none of the new generation guys because they're all in on.
Right.
And I just don't think that the government is prepared to even discreetly enter in that kind of an arrangement.
I was just thinking they could just do it, under the carpet or under the table. Sorry.
See, part of the problem that got us to where we are today was our government pursued a policy that was essentially decapitation. Now, they euphemistically called it the kingpin strategy.
Right.
Well, what they did is they started targeting the leaders. Now, the first one of these guys that they got that wasn't part of their strategy was Feliz Gallardo back in '89. Well, there were valuable lessons that should have been learned from that episode. Obviously, they had to get Feliz Gallardo and the other guys because they killed the DEA agent. But the consequence of taking this guy off the market resulted in the fragmenting of his cartel. There was no longer a top-down leadership. So now you had 4 cartels operating independently. So what happens when you enter competition into the marketplace? What happens?
Well, what the price goes up and
Prices come down.
Okay. You're killing. Stop giving me the opportunity to make a bad decision.
Okay. Okay. Prices come down when there's competition, which is why our country has a long tradition of anti-monopolistic.
Okay, I thought you were going to say like there was infighting, which drives the prices up.
No,
but, okay.
See, on the American side, they gain market share through cutting prices. On the Mexican side, they go to war. But that was essentially what happened for the first 15 years.
Okay.
And because the war was so egregious, our government, working with their lackeys in the Mexican government, started targeting cartel heads. And this is where Guzman and Zambada really showed how devious they were. Because they were the weakest of the 4 cartels. And they were losing ground. You got the Zetas coming in with the Gulf on one side. You got Tijuana coming on the other side. So they formed their federation as a holding pattern. Then Guzman reaches out to his lawyer in San Diego and says, hey, feed the Americans this information. Because he's paying for intel.
Right.
Arellano's going to be over here. Boom. Now they go get him.
The DEA goes against
The DEA gives the information to the Mexicans go get him.
Right.
So they knock off. So what?
So Guzman starts giving information to knock off the heads of his rivals.
Of his rivals. And so in 2002, they decapitate the Tijuana cartel. In 2003, they decapitate the Gulf. In 2004, Juarez. By 2005, they're the last men standing. Because they're able to step into the void when there's all this chaos and capitalize on the opportunity to say, okay, now we're taking over.
Right.
And so the one group that really resisted was what happened in Juarez, where it just turned into the biggest war zone. I mean, there was more homicides in Juarez than there were deaths in Iraq. I mean, it was just all-out war. And so in 2006, there was a contested election where the president of Mexico was a guy named Calderon. He won. And in order to shore up his popularity, he does two things that prior to that had never been done in Mexico. He agrees to start extraditing Mexican nationals to the United States.
Right.
Well, that changes things. Because the Mexican nationals, as long as they're staying in Mexico, they can keep running their business. They have a sweet time in prison.
Right.
Whereas you come here, you end up at 80X.
Right.
So when these guys show up, Wet Palma, 80X, Ocio Cardenas, 80X. So that means now on the Mexican side, they're not going quietly.
Right.
Second issue that they did is they decided to allow like discrete American military units to participate. And so they start decapitating the heads of these organizations. Now, they didn't learn the lesson from what happened with Feliz Gallardo, because when you decapitated back then, you created 4 cartels. Well, once you start decapitating again, the leadership of Sinaloa began to fragment. They killed Beltran Leyva, they killed Nacho Coronel. Well, these men controlled territory. Now, I'm not saying these are good men, but they're the kind of men that you need in place to control 40 organizations.
Right.
And so when you remove Coronel from the picture, what happens? You got
infighting, right?
Infighting. Yes, all of a sudden you got 40 organizations and they're all thinking, I'm going to be top dog.
Right.
And so one of the groups was the group led by Mencho. They form an alliance. The old Valencia organization forms an alliance with Nacho Coronel's nephews and sons. And all of a sudden, what do you have? The new generation. The new generation would have never existed had you just left Nacho Coronel in place. Prior to 2013, was there any fentanyl coming out of Mexico? No. Was there ever any fentanyl coming out prior to 2010 when Coronel was killed? No.
So this is a product that's been around forever, and yet these guys never considered using it.
No. Look, prior to 2015, all fentanyl-related cases in the United States, nearly every one of them involved Chinese nationals. It was being produced in China, coming to the U.S., primarily through the mail. Well, in 2015, our government enters into an agreement with the Chinese government where their postal services were essentially going to work hand in hand. So China Post essentially becomes an investigative agency of the U.S. Postal Service. So now the Chinese are like, okay, well, we're already shipping tons of precursor chemicals to Mexico for the Mexicans to make methamphetamine. Why don't we just ship them the precursors and they can make the...
And the cartels, different cartels have control of the ports of entry, so it's easy to get it in.
Yes, and yes, that's exactly what it is. And that's why the new generation all of a sudden became so powerful, because they control the 2 ports. The 2 largest ports in Mexico on the Pacific coast are in their territory. So there's one in Colima, there's one in Michoacan. So now you've got an enormous infrastructure that was already in place for all this massive amphetamine manufacturing. Now they just added to that.
Just another chemical, just another load. Yeah.
Just a different mixture. And so the growth of fentanyl in the United States is a direct result of the American decapitation policy. You took out the guy who didn't allow it to happen. Prior to Guzman getting arrested in 16, no cases in the United States. From Mexico.
Right.
It had emerged as an issue in 13, 14, and 15 from the Chinese. You bring Guzman, all of a sudden, you kill Coronel, kill Beltran-Leyva, Azul dies, Mayo's 80, the old guard's gone. You've got these younger guys that are like, you know what? We don't need to make money on volume. We can do volume and maximize profit per unit. Well, that's where it comes in. Whether it's dealing with heroin, they cut it. Dealing with cocaine, they cut it. Like, there's no reasonable way today anybody could be involved in drug trafficking simply because you cannot attest to the quality of the product. One of the reasons why the government came down so hard on, in my case, was because the product had impeccable purity levels.
Right.
Nearly all of the seizures in my case, 100% pure, 100% pure, 100% pure. Well, on the one hand, that not necessarily causes them to target you all that much more, but on the other hand, there's no harmful impurities. Today, you can't say that. You could be thinking you're trafficking in good faith, and all of a sudden you're going to get charged with a homicide because some guy ends up taking like you can't. The market is completely changed. Like, it's completely foolish today to get involved with drug trafficking. Now, it may have been foolish 30 years ago because you get a lot of time, but today, like, I wouldn't even think about doing a line. You know what I mean? It's at the point now where.
But people do.
Well, and that's why you get 112,000 fatalities last year.
I was going to say, well, and that's also the thing is that you're probably just not going to be able to stop the end user. If they're willing to take that risk every single time, you're not going to be able to stop them unless you put them all into drug rehabs. Well,
and that's why you have to remove the fentanyl from the equation.
Right.
But remember, market participants respond to incentives. Threats don't work. By threatening, they command a premium. You're just making more money.
Right.
You have to undermine the pricing structure. You have to make it to the point where it is now not in their economic interest to engage in fentanyl. Well, that requires a trade-off. We're not going to decapitate your faction as long as you agree. No, we are going to decapitate all the rest. That's the kind of creative solution that would at least get a handle on the situation to where you're going to see, you're not going to stop people, obviously, from getting high. It's been going on for decades. But at least you're going to lower that number to the point where it gets back to being manageable.
Right.
When I got prosecuted back in the mid-90s, from the government's perspective, it was a large case. They threw all kinds of what I consider to be a little bit disingenuous rhetoric.
Mm-hmm.
Because today, they're desperate to get back to Rausini levels.
Right.
Like, you didn't know how good you had it.
Right.
Back in 93, 94, 95, 96. And that's why I think that in the end, it's going to take someone with a lot of balls to step the hell up and say, you know what, we're just going to completely change how we handle it.
But you don't, I was going to say, but you don't think that's going to happen?
No.
No, nobody's going to do that.
No.
No, because like you said, it'd be soft on crime. They would consider it soft on crime. I mean, like I've always said, like, look, what you ought to do is just like let these guys out of prison and just, reduce the sentences dramatically, make them all take some type of an RDAP program, and then just take the money that you save and just make free drug rehabs. Like if people want to, they can just go to free drug rehabs and make it legal and then tax the living shit out of it, make sure it's super pure. And, and then, like to me, now you don't have to rob. You can be a functional addict. Yeah. You can go get a job in a factory. You can still do your drugs. It's just like drinking. It's reasonably priced. You can do it. And if it becomes an issue for you, you have a free drug rehab you can go to. And guess what? They can't fire you from your job. You're allowed to go for 60 days. You're allowed to dry out. You're allowed to you go right back to your job. Like you can, the amount of money that they spend on prisons to give that guy 10 years, you can just let him go to a drug rehab.
But yes, and that's what you're saying is essentially what I was saying earlier. You're reducing the penalties.
Right. I'm just saying.
But the cost savings aren't on the incarceration. It's on the law enforcement actions.
Well, I think it's across the board. You're still saving money on that too. Maybe not as much because you can reduce the amount of law enforcement you need to enforce these laws. But regardless, at the very least, it's going to cut the fucking the prison by half. The prison budget for prisons in state and in federal prison by half, because it's like 60% of all the guys that are locked up for drugs.
Yes, look,
I'm not saying nobody should go for drugs, but you would be able to really reduce the hell out of it.
Well, I agree. I just don't think that would be palatable from the political perspective. I think lowering the 112,000 is the priority.
No, I think that's how you're saying you can't sell that to the public.
You can't sell
to the public. But okay, if you take that out of the equation, like for, I'll give you an example. I mentioned this the other day, and there were just tons of people who were like, "Well, they tried that in Washington. It's like saying in California, saying, oh, we're gonna fix homeless situation. We're gonna make it. We're gonna pay these guys. We're gonna give them places to live. We're gonna give them fun." So what happened was all the people in the country that are homeless are swarming in there. It's profitable. They're like, there are guys they interview. They're like, listen, it pays to be homeless in California. And so they swarm in there. Yeah. Okay. What I'm saying is, and so guys are saying by legalizing drugs in like Washington state, they're like, that's ridiculous. It ruined this. Well, wait a minute. That's because people swarmed in there to take advantage of it. I'm saying there's nowhere to go. Yeah. I'm saying it's across the United States. So nobody's going to swarm to California to be homeless or go to Washington to be a full-time drug addict when they can just stay where they're at right now. Yeah. So you're not going to have that influx. Is it going to change society? Maybe you're going to see people shooting up in public but you can always arrest those people. And they realize, hey, look, if I'm going to do it, I have to do it in my home. I can't do it in front of kids. Mm-hmm. I can't do it here. I can't. So those people, they get arrested. They go to jail for 20 days. Is it a long time? No, it's not a long time. But 20 days is enough to disrupt your life so bad you don't want to get arrested again. Yeah. Listen, the difference between being arrested for 3 months and 3 years is comparable. The reason I say that is in 3 months, you've lost your house, you've lost your job, you've lost all your stuff. The same thing in 3 years from now is the same thing. You're basically getting out the same. So you might as well just give them 3 months. Why would I spend the extra money to keep you locked up for 3 years when the effect it's had to your life occurred at 90 days? I don't need to give you 3 years or 5 or 10 or 15. I've disrupted your life so badly in 90 days that you don't want to go to jail for another 90 days. So to me, why would I pay for the whole 3 years?
I mean, that's a reasonable argument. I'm not making it. Right. I don't think decriminalization or legalization is on the table, and I'm not even advocating for it. Right. I'm simply saying there's a smarter way to operate.
You're saying still arrest them, but don't give them 10, 15, 20 years. Give them 2 years. Give them a year. Give them, right. I mean, in ways, to me, I feel like it's similar, because if you're going to learn your lesson, you're going to learn it probably in 2 or 3 years, just like you are in 20. No one's learning their lesson. Right.
It's not changing people's behavior. It's changing people's incentives. I'm not going to risk an inconvenient 2-year prison sentence to make $3 or $4 grand this month.
Right.
But you will take that same risk to make $1 million.
Yeah.
Even if it's a 10-year risk, men will take it. And so you need to undermine the profits associated with the trafficking.
Right. That's what I'm also saying, is that by legalizing it, you're undermining the profits, because you could legally make this drug here in the United States.
I agree, but I just don't think that's even on the table.
Right. Well, no, I know. I'm not saying none of it's on the table.
Yeah.
Because nobody's ever going to do that. Because listen, the moment they do that and anything goes wrong, because it would be horrific it'd be a 10-year adjustment period that would be horrific. All kinds of just like you said, there would be all kinds of unintended consequences. And anytime somebody still died, or something went wrong, or there was a shooting, or there was this, or there's that, it would immediately be like, well, you're the one that put these policies.
Yeah, of course.
You're the one. Well, I understand. And it's horrific for about 10 years, but in 10 years, it'll level out and we'll be in Amsterdam. I went to Amsterdam. It was beautiful. It was wonderful. It was nice. People could walk. You could walk in and get cookies with marijuana in it. And you could now, but they don't have, everything isn't, everybody thinks, oh, well, it's all legal. It's not. Like you can't go in and say, hey, can I get an ecstasy pill? They'll kick you out of the store. And what's so funny too is they won't say like, yeah, there's a guy they'll kick you out.
Yeah.
They'll say, get out. You're like, what? No, I'm sorry. I can't serve you. That's illegal. That you need to leave. You're like, you're selling marijuana brownies. What are you talking about? You got gummy bears. Doesn't matter. That's legal. This isn't. And it's so lucrative for them. I don't mess with anything like that. And even if you got arrested for it, the penalties are very, very light.
Yeah. Well, it's a much more rational approach.
Right.
And there has to be a number at some point. Because when you go, 106,000 3 years ago, 109,000 2 years ago, 112,000 last year, at what number do you say, okay, we have to change? Is it 250,000? Is it 1 million?
Imagine how much money would be saved. Like, I mean, I understand you're saying, oh, the fentanyl, it's horrible.
That's
And
all I'm addressing.
but
Is the fentanyl issue.
I understand, but I mean, let's face it, we're not losing patriots here. So I'm, that's not a big deal. What bothers me is the money angle. Like, I want free healthcare, bro. I want free healthcare, and I feel like if you get rid of the DEA, get rid of half the FBI, get rid of half these government people, then I feel like I can get free healthcare. That's what I want. Okay, if we can get free healthcare out of here, or free healthcare out of
That's a win-win.
That's a win for me. I'm not that concerned with the X amount of drug addicts that are losing their lives. Like, I feel bad, but that's bro. What you knew what was going on.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I'm sure some of them are just nice high school kids that I feel horrible about, but still.
Well, that's why earlier I made the comment that the market has completely changed, because today it's just a game of Russian roulette.
Right.
Because essentially you've got 3 guys with absolutely no skills, no training, using buckets and just mixing. And sometimes the concentrations are going to be different. And if you get the wrong
batch
or the wrong bindle,
Right.
the wrong gram. And that's why I think that at some point you're going to see the Mexicans taking it upon themselves to say, hey, look, we're willing to do this. Someone's going to do it because it's the smart move.
Right.
Whether we accept that invitation, that's to be seen, or discreetly, whether we go to them. Like today you hear there's a lot of people, particularly on the right, saying we should declare them terrorists. First of all, they're criminals.
Right.
And so if you want to start sending American military personnel into Mexico, that's an interesting plan. But on the other hand, they shoot back.
Oh, you'd have to just take over Mexico, which
That's-
is something I've advocated for,
Well-
which you also have never. I advocated so hard in one video, Colby wouldn't even post a video. I mean, I was saying go in and it's going to be just some mass execution.
Well, and see, that's why, when, to Reagan's credit, he shut down the border.
Right.
No one today is talking about that.
Right.
They're talking about bombing. They're talking about invading. No one's talking about shutting down the border. Why? Because Mexico has this captive. Ever since NAFTA, a lot of American companies went and established their manufacturing just south of the border. So today, if we shut down the border, you're hurting American companies.
Right.
And so we've lost that ability to create that leverage.
Your suggestion is back off, put some guys in power that will take care of it in Mexico.
Yes, that's my suggestion.
I mean, I'm sure you would have said it much more eloquently than I just said it.
You want to wrap it up, or?
I can't believe that you prepared this for this. We have to focus you in a way that can make you some money, as opposed to you could have just riffed this whole thing. You don't even need those notes. You could have done this without the notes.
Well, because I wanted to have it logically progress, and I can't logically progress with you because you jump around.
I cut to the chase. Look,
I got second order, third order, fourth order, fifth order consequences, and you're just like,
you need a YouTube channel to focus some of this energy.
Do you want me to give you guys a clean copy of this, and you can post the work product and say we never got to it?
Serious? No.
Okay, I'm just checking.
I'm not going to subject anybody to this. I've been through this. Listen, he wrote essentially, he wrote the backstory, a story I wrote called American Narco, which was a Carrie Lee Woolsey story. And Pete wrote, if I had written that story, it would have been 8,000 words. It's like 14 to 16,000 words because Pete wrote the backstory to the formation of the cartel and the evolution of the cartel, and the creation of the federation, and then kind of how it was dismantled. So there's I'd say 30% of the story, maybe 25% of the story, is about just the cartel and the chain that marijuana goes through to get in the United States and how it gets here and how it ends up in Fort Myers to Carrie Woolsey and how he distributes it and how they met. We interweave these two stories. If I had written what Pete wrote, like Pete would write this stuff up, he'd give me 6 pages. I'd condense it to 2 paragraphs. He'd give me 8 pages, would be 1 paragraph. He'd give me 4 paragraphs, it'd be, or 4 pages, 2 paragraphs. And every time, and I would say, Pete, I'm asking you to give me 1 paragraph on this. 2 days later, here's your 3 pages. 1 paragraph. Well, I wanted to make sure you had enough backstory to understand the formation of the, it was important that and then when he would edit the stories, listen, he's using fucking words. I don't know what you're like. I'm like, I said, they combined this. He's like, it was more of a conflation. I've never heard the word conflation in my life. Like, what do you mean? Nobody, if I haven't heard of it, the people that read this, I promise you haven't heard of it. And he just, it was insane. He's like, well, when we write the book. We're not writing a book, Pete. We're writing 10,000 words at most. It ended up being like 14,000 words or something, 15,000 words. It was, it was good. It was a good story, but not because of him. He wrote so much information on every single aspect. It could have been a book, but we trimmed it down because the main story is about Carrie Lee Woolsey, but it is super cool. The backstory is super cool too.
Well, the parallel storylines, give it the gritty nature of the story.
So, but what's so funny is when I sent it to when I gave it to not Carrie, but when I gave it to Danny, and Danny Swoop.
Daniel Sweep.
When I gave it to Danny, like, he didn't like it at all because he's like, it makes it sound like we're working hand in hand with the cartel. It's like, you were working hand in hand together. He's like, but I'm like, you were working with this guy that was with the cartel. Right? Well, yeah, but it makes it sound like, didn't you go into Mexico and meet cartel members and go to one of their warehouses?
With 100 tons?
Yeah, that Pete didn't suggest it. You told me there were hundreds of tons. It was piled up to the ceiling. It was, you met with this guy, like, you told me that. He's like, yeah, but I really didn't like this angle. It makes it sound like we were an integral part of, well, that's what your indictment says. That's what the U.S. attorney said. That's what, and he's, so he read it. He said by the 3rd time he read it, he said, I read it 3 times. I read it once, had a conversation with me, let a couple of his buddies read it. He read it again. A couple weeks later, he read it again. He came back and he said, man, it's an awesome story. I just never thought of doing a parallel story, a sub story of the cartel and how the product is created, how it evolved, how it ends up in the U.S., how people like us are intricate in that chain. But once he read it and realized it and thought about it, he's like, yeah, you're right. There's nothing without guys like us.
That's right.
Without someone like us to distribute it and sell it to dealers and traffic it. Like, there's no, like, you're right. And not just that, it was the same thing with Carrie. Carrie was always like, it was like, I don't know, 50, 100 pounds. Well, I have the report. They caught this guy with 300 pounds. maybe 300. He was always downplaying,
Yeah.
downplaying. And it's like, he's like, I've never even seen, this much weed. I mean, yeah. Okay. Well, the indictment says it was 14, you were caught with 1,400 pounds. Maybe. I mean, okay. Yeah. Well, you obviously ordered the 1,400. I don't know why we have to put that. I don't know why, why are you focusing on, I especially don't like that you put half a ton. That's unreasonable. It is half a ton. He's like, I don't know what you're doing here. Like, I'm being honest. Like, you're the one, they didn't give you 12 years because you were selling dime bags. You got 12 years. He's like, well, the mandatory minimum is 10 years. You didn't get the mandatory minimum. You got 12. So you can't even say that I should have gotten 3, but I got 10 because that's the minimum they could give me. No, you got 12. This is where you fell on the guidelines. I don't think he ever really liked the story. But Danny, and listen, everybody, because I actually went to a party in Fort Myers. We went to Danny's birthday party.
Mm-hmm.
I have videos of it. I'm going to show you the videos in a minute. But I went to his birthday party, which was insane. Like, it was a rock. There was a rock concert. Like, they're friends with, like, and I'm going to say that, guys, he's like one of their next door neighbors and one of their good friends. Like, one of them's like a member of like Metallica or something. And so they have these guys come, and then one of them's another guy who's like with like Leonard Skinner or something. They come and they perform. They had a full set. Mm-hmm. Like, whoever does his stuff came out. There was a full concert set. I mean, it was insane. They had a Ferris wheel. They had, and it was the most amazing thing. They had women walking around on stilts, juggling and blowing fire, and it was like, wow, this is insane. Doing they had like glow sticks and all kinds of so, and it was all at night. So, but everybody that came up to me, they'd go, "Hey, you wrote American Narco," and I'd be like, "Yeah." They'd be like, "Bro, great fucking story, man." That I never really understood the story until I read that. Like, I knew he got arrested, but I had no idea. So, not that he wasn't already in this town, Fort Myers, not that he wasn't already like a celebrity in the town. But then when they read the story, now his celebrity became even bigger.
Yeah.
Because now the backstory, he's a musician. If you read the article, he's actually a musician, an amazingly talented musician. Sure. He gave a concert just before he left at Coleman. And so in the story, this is funny. In the story, he talks about being in San Diego, and they went to a Mexican bar, and these bars are massive.
Cantina.
Yeah, it's huge, right? Mm-hmm. So, and his cartel contact, Apple, goes to the guys that are playing the Mexican band,
Banda.
Yeah, and says, "Hey, this guy's a singer. Like, he has a band, he's a singer." And they call him up on stage, and he's like, no, I don't sing. They're like, you gotta sing. He's like, no. And he's like, no, I don't sing, you wouldn't know any of the songs. And the guy goes, do you know, what was it by Scorpions? What was the name of the song? Do you remember? It was, oh my gosh, it was hilarious.
That was such a great scene.
The band leader asks Carrie, do you know the Scorpions Still Loving You? And Carrie goes, I actually do know Still Loving You. He's like, I don't know a lot of their songs, but I do know Still Loving You. So Carrie gets up on stage. He said, they've been playing Mexican music all night. He said, well, the lights come on. And he said, so the lights come on. He's like, so I'm blinded. I can't see the crowd. He said, and I'm thinking, they're not going to like this. He goes, but so I start off with Still Loving You. I start off the song. He goes, and as I'm singing and singing and singing, and he said, it goes like you can kind of hear them in the background, but I can't really sing them. He goes, he sings the entire song. And he said, when it finally comes up to the point, to the crescendo or whatever, he said, the lights dim, and I look out and can see all the Mexicans staring at him. And he's like, he ends it, Still Loving You, how it ends. And he said, it goes dark, and he looks out, and he said, they go, bah! and they just scream
Massive,
like just massive.
Massive eruption.
He said, listen, bro, he said, that may have been like the pinnacle of my life. Like that may have been the most, he said, and he played with Three Doors Down.
Yeah, big
he
concerts.
played with Lenny Kravitz. And he said, I couldn't fucking believe the way these guys went nuts. He said, it was amazing. It's just.
That's the best scene in the story.
And that's what I'm saying. When I had that discussion with those producers the other day, that's the scene they said. They were talking about his thing being a one episode.
Mm-hmm.
And they said, but honestly, I said, you understand how many people I said he can get that were involved in this whole thing that can be interviewed? I said, you've got 10 people, 12 people. Mm-hmm. That's not including DEA agents, everybody else. And I said, I'm telling you, they said, you know that one scene? And I was like, I go,
Still Loving You.
Yeah, I said the bar scene where he sings, and they were like, the guy goes, listen, he said, that was amazing. He said, that was an amazing scene. I said, and he goes, and then when Carrie afterward, you're talking to him, and
his discussion with Manzana.
No, his discussion with
with
me.
you, or I just wanted to be a rock star.
Yeah, he's like, I just wanted to be a rock star. He goes, I don't know why that wasn't enough for me. Mm-hmm. And I said, and he tears up when he's telling me about it. He said, bro, he said, when I read that, he said, I'm telling you, he said, it hit me hard.
Me too.
He said, hard. He said, that scene alone is amazing. He said, that's worth a 3-part documentary. I said, bro, I'm telling you, this guy can get you 10 people to interview. He's a legend in that town. They love it. And I'm talking to people like Danny's hitting me going, like, I'm like, hey, and I talk to a guy and walks off. Danny walks up and hits me. He's like, that's so-and-so. And he's like, from the story and and I'm like, is that the guy that was on the couch? And I'm like, oh my God, that's the guy. I'm like, I can't remember names. I'm like, really? He's like, yeah. And I'm like, he's like, oh, listen, half the guys are here. He's like, this guy, some people have moved away. They can't make the party, but listen.
Tell him about the first scene. Is he familiar with the story?
No.
Where they show up at the RV and they start pulling out.
Yeah. That's I open it with the RV showing up. Well, what happened is he bought some weed from one guy. He got like half a pound. Then it was a pound or 2 pounds. He said, then the guy shows up one time.
Well, he escalated to about a couple 100 pounds.
Yeah. I'm saying it went from like half a pound to maybe 2 pounds. Then he asked for like 50 pounds or something, or no, 20 or something. The guy shows up with like 100.
Yeah.
And then he comes and the guy's like, he reorders it, and the guy shows up with an RV. And he's like, the guy goes, come in. He walks in the RV. He's like, okay. He's like, yeah, look at my RV. He's like, okay. He's like, I'm wondering, like, where's the weed? I'm supposed to get like 100 pounds at this point or something. The guy's like, yeah, watch. He goes up to the console in the RV and he turns this and pushes this button, and you hear this, like a little air thing.
Hydraulic setup.
A little square, little 12 by 12 square of carpet in the middle of the carpet. He said, raises up. And it's just a pole. He's like, huh, okay. He's like, it's kind of cool. Guy reaches down and grabs a pound, pulls out a pound. Like it barely fits through, but it's tied to something, to another pound, about 6 inches between them. So he pulls it out and pulls that one and gives it to him and pulls another one. They're like, I think they're cutting him or something. Hands that pound to the guy, pulls another one out, hands that. So then they're kind of running back and forth for the house where they're going to put it. Then it's another pound and another one. And he goes, now we're a conveyor belt. Now there's 3 or 4 of us running back and forth. Before you know it, he's like, it gets to a point where it's more than 100 pounds. Then it's 200 pounds. Then it's 300 pounds. Then it's 400 pounds. It's piling up because we got it piled up on. First it was like the table. Then it's on the ground. Then it's on the furniture. Then it's here. It's like what, 1,400 pounds or something like that. He's like, literally, I can't get rid of this much. I can't get rid of it. Oh no, it's going to be okay. It's like, I can't pay for this much. I go, no, I'm fronting it. It's okay. You're good. You're good for it. He's like, they're freaking out. He's like, I'm thinking, oh my God, they're going to kill me. They're going to give me 1,400 pounds. I can't move that much. I don't. Of course he does, but his one buddy is when the guy drives off. His one buddy's sitting, and it's his house. So it's his buddy's house because he lives in the middle of nowhere. He's laying on the couch going, like almost passed out. And he said he's having a panic attack. He said all he kept saying over and over again is like, I can't be a part of this, Carrie. I can't be a part of this. I can't be a part of this. I can't.
He got a half a ton in his living room.
He's got a half a ton of marijuana. But Carrie was like, I moved it very quickly. He's like, it was shocking how quickly I moved it. He's like, you know, he's like, I mean, the guys that were taking a pound are now taking, 100. But yeah, it's a great, the whole story is great. But yeah, that may end up being a 3-part whatever, maybe. We'll see. So Zach and I, we did a video reviewing my Dateline episode.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
And the worst thing was that Zach the whole time, like Allison Arnold would come on and she'd be like, I mean, I met him and he was a nice guy. And what did she say? He said, you just need somebody to believe in you. And so Zach goes, "Aw," and I look at him, and then 2 minutes later she said something else, and he goes, "Aw," and I go, "Hey, stop with that, stop." He's like, "Poor Allison." I go, stop with it." The whole time he's like, we'd stop, and he'd be like, "Did you really do that?" I go, "No, that didn't happen the way it happened. That's not the way that." And he's like,
Did you talk about?
He goes, "You're a scumbag." Like. The comments in the comments in that video are overwhelmingly just hilarious, and
it has the like ratio had over 1,000, 1.5 thousand likes.
Hilarious.
To dislikes?
No. Just like
is that the ratio?
Well, it's just
no,
normal video that got that many views would not have that many likes normally.
Yeah, it's got 40,000 views, but it's got like 1,000 thumbs up where people like the video, and then the people in it, and what I explain about, they do talk about the single mothers, that he would find single mothers.
Yeah, targeting them.
Right. And I was like, that's not what happened. That's not, listen, you have to understand at the time, that was a big issue in the media. Like, we have to protect single mothers. Mm-hmm. So they made me look like, and Zach's going, was Allison a single mother? I'm like, she had, and then he'd sit there and and then Rebecca, blah, blah, blah. And he'd go, single mother? And I'd be like, fuck you, man. It is hilarious. But then people are in there like, Cox and those single mothers. What's up with this dude? I mean, the guys are just going, but they're hilarious. The comments are hilarious.
You guys ready?
Okay, so
Jess, single mother. Like,
Like one of them.
they were, dirtbag.
does she watch this? Does she?
No,
He didn't watch that one.
I won't watch it.
What? Why?
Just because that was.
You know why? Because they show Allison on it.
Allison doesn't bother. I like Allison.
Okay.
Which is the one that you plied with diamonds?
Yeah. Right.
That Rebecca Halk. I didn't
Well,
play.
she doesn't bother me either.
Look, none of them bother her because they're all in their 50s. So
Yeah. Listen, they get my age, younger and cute, then it's a problem. Trust me.
yeah, if it was a 32-year-old that was a 32-year-old hottie,
Yeah.
I don't know what I'd have to move out of the house.
Don't make eye contact. Why are you making conversation? What are you doing? You love me.
Why are you talking to her? She's a guest on the show.
Who is this girl that said you're so handsome? Who's that? I don't know. It's a comment on a thing. I don't know. It's a comment. I don't know who this person. She said you're handsome. Well, who is she? How do I know who she is?
Well,
Her name is Bunny Rabbit Blue. I don't know, but who's Bunny Rabbit Blue? I don't know.
He plays dumb. I don't know. He knows.
Because that really is what I'm dealing with. Like she'll be driving. She'll think about something that she thinks that's something Matt would say. Get angry. Have an argument in her head.
Mm-hmm.
Get over the argument and then come in or come in mad. And it's like, what are you upset with? I was just on the way here. This happened. I thought that's something you would do. And then the whole argument in her head. It's like, well, I've done nothing.
She just manifests the whole thing.
Sometimes she'll have the whole argument, have the discussion, realize it's wrong, and come in and then tell me about it in the car.
Did she apologize for it? I'm sorry I got mad at you.
But I know I know it was just in my head. And I'm like, oh my God, what's happening? Hey, I appreciate you guys watching the video. Do me a favor, hit the subscribe button. Please hit the bell so you get notified of videos like this. Please leave me a comment. Share the video to anybody that you think would be interested. Do me a favor, check out my Patreon, and please consider joining my Patreon. It really does help. It's $10 a month. I appreciate it. Thank you. See ya.